Are there any data points or kind of things that are top of mind for you that might set the stage for some of the things that we get into?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not like super positive. You remember the movie Groundhog Day, right? We probably can call this a Groundhog year. It seems 26 seems very much like 25. So in 2025, RevPAR declined minus 0.3%. So that's a red zero, and our RevPAR forecast for 26 is a black zero plus 0.6%. Um, the little asterisk to the deceleration in RevPAR is that is highly, highly unusual. So I did a quick chart. It's on LinkedIn, but I just said, hey, when did RevPAR decline? And it's always in a recession, except in 2025, there is no recession. GDP is growing 2+% and RevPAR decline. So that's very, very unusual. So we expect that this year that's not going to be the case. So GDP is growing. And so we think RevPAR is going to grow. So, but not a whole lot, from a red zero to a black zero. So it's like flat down to flat up. So more of the same, unfortunately. Now, your mileage may vary. Luxury will continue to do much better than economy. Yes, we have a World Cup. Those 11 markets plus Toronto plus Vancouver will do quite well in June of July. So there are sort of pockets of resistance, but overall for the outlook for the year, we're proposing kind of slow and steady, more of the same.
It's fascinating to hear you say that. And I think, as you just mentioned, there's pockets of growth regionally, even across the chain scales. But it seems like maybe even kind of within chain scales, within regions. One of the things that stood out to me from the Alice conference was what your collaborator on the Tell Me More podcast, Isaac, said around. It was, I forget the exact phrase, but it's something about kind of de-averaging to find the pockets of growth. I think his analysis across the industry was that even last year with sort of flat top line, a challenging environment, I think it was 30% of the hotels in the data set he was looking at were still growing. So I kind of left that session thinking maybe there's growth out there if you de-average. And for those listening to us, it feels like maybe there can be a growth story if you're smart and savvy and you're looking for opportunities.
Yeah, so he's the only one who can do this. I don't have access to the individual property data, but he does because he's on the STR side. He's behind the firewall, so he can look at individual property, and he does it super well, right? Every time he publishes something, I'm like, oh, I just learned something. So the couple of things that stand out to me with that comment is, well, number one, luxury, right? Luxury hotels, high-end hotels and resorts continue to do quite well. There is growth there, maybe not in occupancy, but certainly in room rate growth, right? That the American consumer who has money in the stock market, who's exposed to the stock market, and who owns their own real estate, they just feel pretty good about life and they continue to spend. That's one. I think the other piece, unfortunately, is natural disasters lifted room demand for large swaths of areas in late 2024, the wildfires in LA in 2025. All of this means people get displaced, and then that means we see room demand increase. That's not what we want, but that's just the reality, is that we are always open. We have the generators and we open our doors to say, hey, if you're in need, we have, room and shelter and internet. So that's maybe a little bit the other side of that. But then I think there's also a story here about new hotels or renovated hotels, owners that proactively lean into more expenses to then make the property more attractive, get better reviews online, and that is then self-perpetuating. So we've heard about this conversation about the brands and the owners having this struggle a little bit about the pips, right? That the brands are saying, oh, you need to up your game. And I think a lot of owners are saying, I'll do it. Like, you don't have to hunt me down. I'll do it absolutely, because if my competitors are not, I'll be the new kid on the block, so to speak, because there's so little new supply, right? Supply growth is 0.7% last year. We expect the same number this year. The long run average is 1.6%. So there's just not a whole lot of new supply out there. So if you're the owner and you have the wherewithal to renovate today, you could really, be on the upside, of customer sentiment for a long time.
It's so interesting because I am interested in the broad economic trends and what's happening structurally across the industry, but the practical part of me thinks about, well, what can I do now, right? If I'm an owner or if I'm an operator, what can I do now to create some opportunities for myself, create some growth for myself? And I think what you mentioned is great. Is there any other, I guess, like with regards to data or trends, is there anything else you might advise our listeners to think about or watch that might indicate some areas of opportunity? I think the supply growth is an interesting data point. Anything else that might give them a little visibility into opportunities that might exist for them?
So, selfishly speaking, in the CoStar product, you can see where companies sign leases for the future. So you can see if you have a hotel in downtown, who is signing leases in the office towers in a mile around your property and when are they moving in? And you can be proactive and reach out to them today and say, hey, I can see that you signed a lease down the block. We want to be your preferred business hotel. So that sort of intel exists. It's not out there for free, obviously, but it does exist. I think the other part around the World Cup, a lot has been talked about those, 11 markets, plus Vancouver, plus Toronto that are hosting, plus the 3 markets in Mexico, of course, that are hosting the games. The thing that we haven't really focused a whole lot on is this is a weird term, but the base camps. So Japan picked Nashville as their base camp. So the Japanese national team will be here in June and July, depending on how far they go in the tournament, obviously. But Nashville is not a city that is hosting a game. So this is just sort of like found demand that wasn't there before. And I assume that the Japanese press is going to show up here in force to cover Nashville, Tennessee, and Broadway, but also then to travel with its team, but then make Nashville its home base. And just like that, I know France and Germany picked their base camp, but there are 48 nations, where the national team will come, plus the press corps, plus some fans. So I think on the margins that could be helpful in a bunch of markets that thought that they would not get any lift from the World Cup.
This is so great. This is why it's so fun to talk with you, Jan, because, for our listeners that may not know this, we have usually some talking points we're hoping to cover. And then also just like, we just roll with it. And that was probably the best product plug I've ever heard in the 1100 episodes on this show, because you might sell it, but at the end of the day, it's kind of like, what are the resources, right? And this is the first time I've heard about, hey, here's an opportunity. So I'll include a link in the show notes. People can check that out, right? I want our listeners to be really proactive. How do you identify opportunity and get after it? So I appreciate those 2 recommendations. I think, so there's the proactivity piece. I think we'd be remiss to kind of position it as there's all operators and participants are equally set up for success the same. And I am curious, kind of in this world where, top line has been flattish, maybe flattish down, maybe flattish up. But you also have the math not really working for many hotels because you have costs, kind of skyrocketing, outpacing the rate of inflation growth. Are there any participants in the hospitality ecosystem that you feel are just structurally advantaged to exist and kind of thrive in? I don't know if it's like on the economy, the extended stay side, or luxury you mentioned as a highlight. Any sort of structural advantages you see for some players right now?
Yeah, you need to be able to have your staff wear multiple hats. If that's possible, then you can keep your staff costs at bay. In a lot of union environments, I know that that's not that's structurally not possible, and that will continue to hurt. But if you can cross-train your people and continue to say, oh, you're checking people in, but you're also the barista in the morning, plus you're also the bartender at night, all of those cross-training opportunities, I think, will be more and more and more in the forefront, because labor cost continues to accelerate, continues to increase, it continues to take a larger share of revenues. And when we look at our P&L data, and we have, I think, like 6,800 or 7,800 hotels giving us detailed line item P&L data, we can clearly see that the GOP as a percent of revenue is going down, that the EBITDA as a percent of revenue is going down. And part of the reason there is the increases in labor cost, and we're all talking in the general news media, obviously, about immigration reform. but the reality is the number of immigrants is slowing. And those are always, not always, those are a lot of the people that we try to hire in our line level positions, in our housekeeping positions. And if they're not available, we just have to increase our wages. That conversation is not going away this year. It's probably not going to go away next year.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I think so. My first job in hospitality was one of those jobs. It was a property type where you had to wear a lot of hats, and I was checking people in. I was helping them with their bags. I was sometimes cleaning the rooms. I was also doubling as their social media manager. And it's like every property doesn't have that ability, but it's also fun as an employee. Like I remember really enjoying these different ways of working across the property. So it's interesting you say that. I think just kind of building on the last thing you said there, one of the things that we talked about in our last conversation was rhetoric and how rhetoric can affect just how things play out. And you talked about that kind of early, and even when there wasn't a ton of data, there was starting to see some indications of how rhetoric on, kind of a national and international level affected travel flows and things like that, whether it's regard to travel demand or people wanting to work in hospitality. I'm curious how you think about that now, 10 months or so, after we first talked, whether from a data perspective or just kind of things that you see out there. Do you still feel this is the case where rhetoric really makes a difference on the business performance of hospitality?
Yeah, unfortunately, now I have the data to back this up. Now we have the data to say, yes, rhetoric matters. And a couple of data points just for you and your audience. So I have been a big fan of the I-92 government data. So it tracks international inbound. The Department of Commerce publishes it. It's free. It's a super cool website, actually, because it tells you not just from which country people are coming, but you can do it by city pair. So if you have an international airport, you can actually see how many people fly from London into Cincinnati, no, not Cincinnati, but into Chicago, say. How many people fly from Narita into LAX? So you can do it by airport city pair. So that's, I think, super interesting, going back to your earlier question of what are the data points out there that can point you at sources for customers. Well, the international numbers are down, but at least you can see how many people from Vietnam are coming, into San Francisco. But going back to your earlier question, so the I-92 data shows clearly that the number of international inbound in 25 was down 2.3% compared to 2024. And part of it, I think, is the rhetoric around immigration. Unfortunately, part of it, I think, is the rhetoric around visas. And the administration has said, okay, we will no longer allow permanent visas. But that word permanent is very easily omitted or misunderstood. And so then if I'm not really paying attention to the news, if I'm sitting in Europe or Latin or South America or Asia, I see, the US doesn't allow visas anymore, which is not what they said at all. But it's very easy to misconstrue that. And then you're saying, then, don't worry about it. I'll go somewhere else. The Canadian data is worse than what I just said. So Statistics Canada tracks air and land crossing, and that data is down 27% year over year. So 25 over 24. And it started deteriorating rapidly after the tariff announcements, after the 51st state rhetoric in April. So then the inverse turns out to be true. The stay Canadian, buy Canadian sentiment lifted the Canadian hotel performance. So we talked about US RevPAR down minus 0.3%. Canadian RevPAR was up 4.2% on the heels of 2024 when it was up 4.4%. So you have 2 years of 4% RevPAR growth up north. And when I talk to my colleagues up in Canada, they're like, yeah, we're not going south of the border, or the US is flyover country, and we're just going straight to Mexico or straight to the Caribbean. So that rhetoric mattered in a positive way in that Canadians explored their national parks and their resorts. So, and they stayed home. The other interesting, and I just have to throw this out there since we talk about the data, the I-92 data set showed that more Americans went abroad this year than last year. And you're like, wait, how does that work if the dollar is deteriorating and the American economy is, like, a lot of people feel uncertain? But yeah, we have 2% more Americans flying abroad. And that clearly also, to me, points at this K-shaped economy, right? that the people who have the money said, oh yeah, I can go on a domestic vacation, but let me also look internationally.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I think the data is fascinating to me. I think just on the rhetoric piece, it's also interesting because not most of our listeners aren't working in politics, but you kind of think about your sphere of influence. You think about what you're saying. I think as communicators, as leaders, it just puts weight around what you say, how you say it, whether it affects travel, or I think about, how we talk about working in hospitality. I think, that's just one of the things going through my head as I think about, some of the data you shared. It's like what we say matters, right? So like, let's be really thoughtful about that and think about the implications and think about how this plays out. But I think just to your last point around people traveling, people are still traveling. And I think you and Isaac and have kind of commented on this before on the Tell Me More podcast, but it seems like there's like cruises are doing well, short-term rentals are doing well. And I'm a hotel guy, so I find that a little sad around, why aren't they staying there? It kind of feels, maybe this is something for the hoteliers listening, that, all's not lost. There are people still traveling, and it seems like they're kind of choosing these other options for their travel more than hotels. And maybe there's something there that could be fixed or needs to be fixed.
Yeah, it is not so much a question of people wanting to get away from home, right? Because we know they're doing that. The problem is the high end flies abroad and the middle of the country is saying, oh, maybe I can't afford a hotel. Let me do an Airbnb or a short-term rental, or let me do the other AI, all inclusive, in a cruise, right? All you can eat, you pay once, and then it's not the room plus the food plus the beverage plus the tax plus the parking fee plus the bottle of water for $4. It's you just pay once and that's it. Just as a side note, I was listening to a chief accounting officer for a large cruise, and they introduced this concept of the second wallet. I had never heard this, but he was making the argument.
The second wallet?
The second wallet, yeah. That people pay for the cruise so far in advance that by the time they get to it, they're like, oh, this is free. And then they spend more money on the ship than they thought, because they thought, oh, it's all inclusive. But of course, you can always upgrade, right? There's always other options. And so they said they make a lot of revenue from people saying, oh, I'm here and I don't see it. The money is already gone. So I might as well just spend a little bit more.
That is amazing. That is so interesting. I think everybody who's trying to drive financial performance would love the idea of the second wallet. So I think that is it's really, I can see how that makes sense as a traveler. I can see that's probably me, and really interesting. I think one thing, I'm just kind of going back to the business and the financial kind of part of hospitality. We were talking off air before we were recording. Kind of one thing on your mind is the transaction environment, and I wonder if you could explain for our listeners a little bit about kind of what you've seen unfold over the past quarters with regards to hotel transactions.
Yeah, so at CoStar, we track, obviously, transactions across the commercial real estate spectrum. I just happen to focus on hospitality. But what was interesting for me to see is that the rhetoric, the conversations we had at Alice at 2025, when I talked to a lot of my friends in the broker community, they said, you know what, Jan? This is going to be the year. 2025 is going to be the year where the bid-ask spread collapses and interest rates are going to come down and we're going to see more activity. And then the first half happened, and at NYU, everybody looked at each other and said, well, maybe next year. But when you look at the quarterly data, it actually turns out that there is momentum, right? So in the first quarter of the year, 2025, we sold around, just under $4 billion worth of hotel assets. And that went up to over $8 billion in the fourth quarter. So in there, if you look at the chart, it's sort of a stack of bars that get consecutively higher. And so maybe, I didn't go to Alice, but if I had talked to brokers at Alice, they would have said, this is the year, Jan, when bid-ask spreads collapse and interest rates are coming down. Maybe this year they're right. So eventually they're going to be right. So maybe 2026 is when they are correct. We've seen some interesting, activity in San Francisco is back in vogue. Blackstone bought the Four Seasons. The Park 55 Hilton 3,000 room 2-pack sold out of receivership. Now, to be fair, it sold at a 76% discount, but it sold. So, that's good news. Like it's not worth $1 billion. It was appraised at $1.6 billion, and it came in at like 450 million. So somebody took a
Bargain.
haircut. But
But that bid ask spread is sort of like a seller and a buyer meeting
correct.
is your point.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we will see more of that going forward. There's a variety of reasons for that, too much to get into right now. But I think there is going to be more activity, and the interest rates are lower than they were. And the expectation is that the new Fed chairman will be very active in trying to get the interest rates down even further. And hopefully then that spurs more interest.
Yeah, and I think the more interest, I'm always interested in more capital moving into hospitality. For our listeners who maybe aren't investors or involved in these transactions, what are some of the implications of that? I mean, is this maybe an opportunity for management companies potentially if you have a new owner, and depending on how that's contracted, or are there other implications of this trend of transaction volume increasing that might exist out there?
Well, oftentimes a change in ownership triggers a PIP. So the brands are saying, oh, if I have a new owner, that new owner will have to renovate immediately. So we might finally see a pickup in those renovations that arguably have been a long time coming, and everybody was waiting for them. But then they were supposed to happen in 2020 and 2021. But of course, then nobody had money. And so they got pushed back. And now finally, with change in ownership, we'll probably see some of that. Is there an opportunity for management companies? Maybe. I think a lot of owners have their preferred stable of management companies. And if they step into an ownership position, they already have pre-negotiated, and I know the day that they close, the new management team already steps in. But sure, I think there are some of those conversations ongoing.
That's so interesting. Before we go, I'm curious what else is on your mind as you kind of think about heading into the rest of 2026. You shared a number of data points and resources for our listeners to track. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to be thinking about or watching as we head into the months ahead?
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering that when Isaac from STR and Jan from CoStar with Amanda Haidt from STR and Adam Sachs from Tourism Economics get together in a room and come up with a forecast, we forecast the nation, right? We forecast everything. That's our role. And you can absolutely disagree with that, and you should disagree with that. And I'm right now, after Alice, on a circuit of calls with investment bankers, basically every hour on the hour. I'm speaking to an equity analyst who then has their clients, their private equity clients on the call, and we sort of explain how we think about the world. And I'm getting a lot of, I don't know, pushback, but nudging that our RevPAR forecast is too low. And I'm said, and that's fine. Like, you should think that because you're looking at a different universe. If you're following the high-end real estate investment trusts, the REITs who are exposed to luxury and upper upscale, then 0.6% is not the right number for you. So I think for your listeners out there, you listen to our number, but then you should disagree with it, and you should say, okay, that's the baseline. And let me now write down where STR is wrong and what CoStar is wrong. And here's what they're not seeing. And so then, therefore, I will do better, and put that into my marketing plan and that into my plan. I think that's always like, we're not, this is a conversation, and we are more often than not a baseline that people disagree with. But I think there's value in that. At least we're saying, look, here's what we think the industry is doing. And hopefully your listeners are saying, you know what? I'm not the industry. I'm better than the industry. And here's why, and then they outperform based on their plan, and they just take us as our data as a jumping off point.
Well, Jan, I always learn so much every time we talk. I appreciate what you just shared, the humility, the practicality of that, and I will link to a number of resources that you create. Love your podcast, love your publications. Encourage everyone to check that out. Follow you on LinkedIn. But thank you so much for taking the time to record today.
Thanks for having me. Have a wonderful year ahead, and let's do this again and see how we ended up.